At 11:23 a.m. on September 19, 1944, the steel walls of an M4 Sherman turret rattled as engines roared and artillery thumped across the French countryside. The tank sat just outside Arracourt, half hidden beside a hedgerow, its interior thick with smoke oil and the sharp bite of burnt cordite. Inside that cramped space, Private First Class Walter Kowalsski, a young left-handed replacement mechanic, crouched beside the gun shoulders, tight breath, shallow hands, slick with sweat. 2 days earlier, the loader he replaced had been killed in action when a German round punched through the same turret, and the empty space beside the ready rack still felt wrong. Now, 3 Panzer IV tanks were advancing from roughly 800 yards, their dark shapes cutting through the morning haze as engines climbed in pitch. The Sherman backed into the hedgerow branches, scraping steel, while the commander shouted ranges, and the gunner fought the traverse trying to keep the barrel steady. Walter had loaded only a handful of practice rounds back in the United States, never under fire, never with the gun recoiling 18 inches toward his chest. The proper method was drilled into every tanker face, the breech. 2 hands on the shell ram, forward step clear, 4 seconds if everything went right. But inside a moving turret with tanks closing fast and no time to spare, that method was already failing. Walter turned his back to the gun, and in that instant, with German armor closing and no margin left, one forbidden choice stood between his crew and the next burning wreck. Was breaking the rules the only way to live? By mid-September 1944, the war in Western Europe had entered a strange, dangerous phase that planners had not fully anticipated. After the breakout from Normandy, American armored columns raced east across France, covering distances in days that had once taken weeks, but speed created new vulnerabilities. Fuel ran short, infantry lagged behind, and armored units often advanced faster than the maps and doctrines written for them. The fighting around Arracourt in the rolling farmland of Lorraine was part of that moment of imbalance. Here, elements of the 4th Armored Division pushed into ground that German commanders still believed they could hold with armor and counterattacks. On paper, the terrain favored tanks, open fields broken by hedgerows, shallow rises, and long sight lines measured in hundreds of yards. In reality, it became a killing ground. German forces in Lorraine were battered but not broken, and they still relied on disciplined armored counterstrokes to slow the American advance. Their primary tool was the Panzer IV, backed by anti-tank guns and infantry who knew how to let American tanks come forward before striking. For American crews, this meant sudden engagements at ranges where armor thickness and seconds of reaction time mattered more than maneuver. The M4 Sherman had never been designed for this kind of duel. Conceived in 1941, the Sherman was meant to support infantry exploit breakthroughs and overwhelm defenses through reliability and numbers, not to trade shots head-on with German armor. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States built nearly 49,000 Shermans, betting that production logistics and crew training would outweigh any single technical disadvantage. Against early German tanks, that logic worked. By 1944, it was failing at the point of contact. The Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate about 3 inches of armor at 500 yards, enough to destroy older vehicles, but often insufficient against the frontal armor of a Panzer IV at combat range. Against Panthers and Tigers, the problem was worse, but even Panzer IVs could absorb frontal hits long enough to return fire. In tank combat, the first accurate shot usually decided everything. That turned every engagement into a race measured in seconds. American doctrine tried to solve this with numbers. 5 Shermans moving fast and spreading out were supposed to flank a single German tank and hit it from the side or rear. On a training board, the math worked. In the fields of France, it meant that several American crews were often lost trying to reach those flanking positions. Tankers gave this grim arithmetic a name they did not use lightly: the death ratio. During the summer of 1944, for every German tank destroyed in France, Allied units sometimes lost 4 or even 5 Shermans. At Villers-Bocage in June, a single Tiger knocked out dozens of Allied vehicles in minutes. At Goodwood in July, British armored units lost hundreds of tanks in a single day pushing across open ground. By September, every American tanker in France had seen the aftermath. Burned out Shermans beside roads. hatches blown open, crews who did not come back. The men inside the tanks understood something the manuals struggled to address. Armor thickness mattered. Gun penetration mattered. But when two tanks saw each other at the same time, speed mattered most. That speed did not just belong to engines or turret motors. It belonged to the loader. Inside a Sherman turret, the loader's job was brutally simple and unforgiving. He had to grab a 38-pound shell from the ready rack, align it with a breech ram at home, and step clear so the gun could fire again. The standard expectation was 4 to 5 seconds per round under ideal conditions. Under fire, with the tank moving and the gun recoiling, even that was optimistic. A direct hit to a Sherman's turret often killed the loader first. He stood closest to the ammunition beside racks holding up to 20 shells, and when those rounds were struck or ignited, survival was unlikely. Crews knew this. They watched loaders work faster and faster, pushing themselves because they understood the stakes. Every extra second between shots gave the enemy time to aim. Every fumbled shell widened that window. American commanders tried to compensate in every way they could. Some crews stacked sandbags on the glossy plate, hoping to absorb or deflect incoming rounds. Others welded spare track links to the turret for improvised protection. None of it changed the fundamental problem. The Sherman could not reliably win a frontal duel, so survival came down to who could fire first, adjust faster, and fire again before the enemy did. In Lorraine, that reality collided with a training system built for calm ranges and standard bodies. Tank schools like Fort Knox taught one correct way to load a gun. It was safe, it was repeatable, and it assumed the loader could always face the breech use both hands evenly and work inside a stable platform. Combat stripped those assumptions away. Tanks bounced over rough ground. Turrets slewed suddenly. Men shouted, shells exploded, and the space inside shrank with every movement. Under those conditions, a procedure that was merely slower became lethal. By the time the fighting reached Arracourt, the line between doctrine and survival had grown thin, very thin, and in that narrow gap, one crew would discover that a few seconds gained the wrong way could decide whether a Sherman lived long enough to fire again. Walter Kowalsski did not look like the kind of man armies built legends around. He was a mechanic by trade, broad-shouldered from factory work, but quiet, unassuming, and still new enough to combat that no one mistook him for a veteran. When he arrived in France, he was not assigned to a tank crew because of skill or experience. He was there because someone else had been killed in action, and a slot had to be filled. At training ranges back in Fort Knox, Walter had done what instructors expected, and nothing more. He loaded a handful of practice rounds in a stationary tank following a checklist written for calm conditions and steady hands. There was no chaos there. No shouting, no steel shaking under recoil. In France, none of that applied. Walter was left-handed, something no form ever asked him to report. Instructors had taught him to load right-handed anyway, because that was the method, and methods were not adjusted for individuals. On a practice range, that compromise worked. Inside a moving turret under fire, it became a liability. 2 days before the engagement near Arracourt, his crew had learned just how fragile their routine really was. A German round struck the front of their Sherman, at an angle deflecting upward instead of penetrating. The armor held. Walter did not. The impact slammed him sideways into the turret wall and dislocated his right shoulder hard enough to drop him to one knee. The battalion medic forced the joint back into place, wrapped it tight, and told him what the manual already implied. A loader who could not use both arms was useless. The standard method demanded coordinated strength, both hands working together to control and ram a 38-pound shell. Walter could barely lift that weight with his injured arm, let alone move quickly. On paper, he should have been pulled from the tank. In reality, there was no one to replace him. 4th Armored Division was short of crews. Loaders were being lost faster than they could be trained. The choice was not between a perfect loader and a wounded one. It was between a wounded loader and an empty seat. Walter stayed. That decision forced him to confront something the training manuals never acknowledged. The battlefield did not care about correct form. It cared about results. In the days that followed his injury, Walter tried to make the standard method work. Every attempt ended the same way. Pain flared through his shoulder. The shell slipped. Seconds vanished. Each failure made one truth clearer. If he loaded the gun the way he had been taught, his crew would not survive their next fight. What Walter carried into the turret on September 19th was not confidence or experience. It was a mechanic's instinct, an understanding that leverage mattered, that space mattered, that bodies moved faster when they followed their natural motion instead of fighting it. He did not yet think of it as innovation. He thought of it as necessity. And necessity in war has a way of rewriting rules without asking permission. He had no idea that what he was about to do would spread far beyond his own tank. He only knew that if he failed, the next shell would not be his to load. The first real test came before anyone had time to argue about manuals. On the morning of September 18th, low fog clung to the fields east of Arracourt, turning hedgerows into dark shifting shapes that swallowed sound. 3 German tanks emerged from that haze at roughly 900 yards, engines, steady guns already elevated as if they had rehearsed the approach. Inside the Sherman, the commander called the range, while the gunner began to traverse the turret shuddering as the tank rolled over uneven ground. Walter reached for the first shell with his left hand, his injured right arm hanging stiff at his side. He tried the standard method out of habit, turning to face the breach and lifting with both arms. Pain flashed through his shoulder. The shell tilted in his grip. Seconds slipped away. If this took too long, the fight would end before it began. He turned his back to the gun. Without looking, Walter reached behind himself, fingers brushing hot steel, until they found the rim of the breach. He guided the shell nose backward, using his bent arm and body weight to drive it home. The mechanism caught and slammed shut. The gun fired. Recoil punched heat and smoke into his back. He was already grabbing the next round. Same motion. Back turned. Left hand guiding. 3 seconds. The gun fired again. The German tanks began returning fire shells, snapping past the hedgerow and throwing dirt against the hull. Walter did not stop. 4th round. 5th. His left arm burned muscles, tightening with each movement, but the rhythm held. When the engagement ended, minutes later, 2 enemy tanks burned, and the 3rd pulled back behind cover. Inside the turret, no one spoke. The silence said enough. The next day, the pressure intensified. September 19th brought clearer skies and longer sight lines, the kind German gunners preferred. Enemy armor probed forward again, this time faster, more confident. Walter's crew met them head-on. He loaded without hesitation, now turning his back each time, letting muscle memory take over, while voices shouted around him. 3 seconds, then less. The gunner barely had time to call corrections before the next shell was ready. Within 6 minutes, 4 German tanks lay wrecked across a field 400 yards away. When the firing stopped, the commander climbed down from his hatch and stared at Walter as if seeing him for the first time. That look spread. Other crews noticed. In a battalion bleeding tanks at a brutal rate, any crew that survived a duel drew attention. Loaders began to ask questions in low voices near maintenance sheds and refueling points. They tried the motion themselves, awkward at first, then faster. Back turned. Hand finds steel. Rum. Fire. No one wrote it down. No one asked permission. By September 20, several crews were using the backward method in combat. Their numbers spoke quietly but clearly. They were firing more rounds per engagement. They were landing first hits. They were still climbing out of their tanks at the end of the day. Word moved the only way it could at the front. By demonstration. By survival. A loader would show another in 30 seconds, just long enough to prove it worked. Then the next fight would decide. Every successful engagement made the old method harder to defend. Every burned enemy tank made the risk of punishment feel smaller than the risk of dying. Still, the danger had not disappeared. Turning your back to a loaded cannon violated every safety rule in the book. A misaligned shell could jam the breech. A jam under fire meant a dead tank. Each time Walter loaded blind, he accepted that risk without discussion. There was no room for debate inside the turret. Only motion, only timing, only the narrow space between shots where a loader could either gain seconds or lose his crew. By the end of that week, the change was no longer invisible. Officers began to notice patterns in after-action reports. Engagement times dropped. Kill ratios shifted. Crews that should have been lost were still reporting in. The question was no longer whether the backward method worked. It was how long it could stay unofficial. Because once command noticed, someone would have to decide whether regulations mattered more than results. And that decision was coming fast. The moment of decision did not come under fire. It came during training. A few days after the fights near Arracourt, a line of Shermans sat idling during a battalion exercise, engines rumbling low as crews ran through drills meant to look routine. That was when Creighton Abrams noticed something wrong. One loader did not face the breech. He turned his back. In one smooth motion, the shell was seated and the breech snapped shut. Less than 3 seconds. Abrams raised a hand and stopped the exercise immediately. The engines idled. Every crew froze. The loader climbed out unsure whether he was about to be praised or disciplined. Abrams demanded an explanation. No speeches followed. No theories. Sergeant Miller stepped forward and spoke plainly about Walter, about the injury, about the timing, about the results. He did not argue doctrine. He argued numbers. 2 seconds faster per round. Fewer fumbled shells. More first hits. More crews coming back alive. Abrams listened without interrupting. When Miller finished, Abrams looked at the loader again. Then at the stopwatch in his hand. Do it again. The motion repeated. Back turned. Hand finds steel. Rem. The breech closed. Abrams clicked the watch. Again. Faster. Around them, veteran tankers watched in silence, knowing exactly what was at stake. If Abrams enforced the manual, the method would die there. If he accepted it, he would be overruling years of regulation with one decision. Abrams asked one question. Does it work better than what we teach? Yes, sir. That was enough. Abrams made his choice. He ordered every loader in the battalion to learn the backward method immediately. Not as a suggestion, as a directive. He did not wait for approval from higher command. He did not ask for the manual to be rewritten. He cared about one thing, keeping his crews alive. Within 48 hours, experienced loaders were drilling replacements on the new motion. Walter was brought in to demonstrate repeating the sequence step by step until others could match his time. There were no written instructions, only practice, only proof. The results came quickly. Engagement times dropped. Kill ratios improved. Tanks that should have been lost stayed operational. When word of the change reached 3rd Army headquarters, it did not arrive as a theory. It arrived as data. After-action reports showed a clear shift. And those reports landed on the desk of a commander who valued speed above all else. George Patton did not ask whether the method followed regulations. He asked why it was not already universal. On October 7, 1944, Patton watched loaders demonstrate the technique himself, timing them with his own stopwatch. 3 seconds, then less. Patton turned to his staff and issued a blunt order. Every tank battalion in 3rd Army would adopt the backward loading method immediately. Any commander who refused would be relieved. Any officer who punished a loader for using it would answer directly to him. With that order, the argument ended. What had begun as a desperate improvisation inside one Sherman turret became standard practice across an entire army. The manual did not change. Reality did. And from that point on, the fastest way to load a 75mm gun was no longer the way soldiers had been taught. It was the way that kept them alive. The effect of the change was visible almost immediately, not in speeches, but on the ground where tanks fought, and crews counted who came back. In the days following the adoption of the backward loading method, fields around Arracourt told a different story than they had a week earlier. Burned German tanks lay scattered across open farmland turrets, cracked open tracks twisted and thrown clear by internal explosions. American Shermans still took hits. Some were lost. But fewer brewed up where they stood. Crews reported firing 9 or 10 rounds per engagement instead of 6 or 7, often landing the first accurate shot before German gunners could settle their sights. Those seconds mattered. After-action reports from the 4th Armored Division showed measurable changes. Engagement times dropped from an average of 12 minutes to roughly 8. Kill ratios that had once leaned heavily against American crews moved closer to even. In some actions, they tipped the other way. The most important number was quieter. Crew survival increased. Men who would have been lost during the first exchange now had time to fire again, maneuver, or withdraw under cover. German units noticed the difference as well. Counterattacks that once pressed forward aggressively began to stall earlier. Where Panzer crews had relied on American hesitation between shots, they now found that window closing. For American commanders, the implications were clear. The Sherman had not suddenly become a heavier tank. Its armor had not thickened. Its gun had not changed. What changed was how efficiently a crew could use what they already had. Inside the turret, the backward method reshaped crew coordination. With the loader's profile narrowed, the gunner had more room to work the traverse. The commander could lean down without colliding with shoulders and elbows. Movements that had once caused friction now flowed. Less chaos, fewer mistakes. That cohesion showed in combat. As the method spread across Third Army, its impact compounded. Within 2 weeks, thousands of Sherman loaders were turning their backs to the breach under fire, guided by touch and muscle memory instead of checklists. Between October and December 1944, Third Army's overall tank kill ratio improved significantly, dropping from more than 3 American losses per German tank to closer to 1.5. The backward loading method was not the only factor, but it was one of the few changes that required no new equipment, no new factories, and no delay. It was one of the few changes that required no new equipment, no new factories, and no delay. The irony was impossible to miss. Official manuals still warned against exactly what crews were now doing in combat. No technical bulletin rewrote the rule. No formal doctrine caught up with reality. Yet on the battlefield, the argument was over. The method worked. And in war, what works has a way of surviving even when it exists only in practice and memory. By late 1944, the question was no longer whether the backward loading method saved lives. It was how many. When the war moved on, the paperwork never caught up. The U.S. Army did not rewrite its gunnery manuals to credit a scared mechanic who had turned his back to a cannon in France. Technical regulations continued to state that loaders should face the breech, maintain visual contact, and follow procedures written for ideal conditions. On paper, nothing had changed. On the battlefield, everything had. By the fall of 1944, backward loading had become standard practice across Third Army, not because it was approved, but because it worked. Thousands of Sherman loaders used the technique through the final months of the war in Europe. Many never knew the name of the man who had figured it out. They only knew that they were alive to load the next round. Walter Kowalsski received no medal for the innovation. There was no ceremony, no citation, no line in the official histories praising a violated regulation. The Army does not award decorations for breaking rules even when breaking them saves lives. Walter did receive a promotion. In October 1944, his commander recommended him for corporal and the paperwork went through. He remained a loader with the 37th Tank Battalion fighting through the rest of the war. His tank was hit 3 more times. Each time the crew survived. Between September 1944 and May 1945, Walter's crew destroyed more than 20 German tanks. Every round was loaded the same way. Back turned. Hand finds steel. Ram. Fire. By the end of the war, Walter could load a 75mm shell in just over 2 seconds without looking. After victory in Europe, he went home. Walter returned to Detroit and resumed life as a mechanic working at the Ford River Rouge plant, raising a family and rarely speaking about combat. Like many veterans, he did not think of what he had done as remarkable. It was simply what worked. But the technique did not disappear with him. During the Korean War, American tank crews using modified Shermans were trained on variations of backward loading before deployment. Reports from armored units noted that loader speed mattered most in close-range engagements. The method gave crews a measurable edge. In Vietnam, crews operating heavier tanks adapted the same principles to larger guns. Even early M1 Abrams crews were taught modified versions of the backward grip during training decades later, long after automation began to change tank warfare. The physics never changed. Leverage still mattered. Natural motion still mattered. What Walter had discovered under fire continued to shape how armored crews survived. Only years later did historians begin to piece the story together. Research into after-action reports from 4th Armored Division revealed unexplained improvements in engagement time and survival rates during late 1944. Those numbers pointed back to a single change on the loader's side of the turret. Estimates suggest that the technique may have contributed to saving hundreds of American tank crew lives in Europe alone. Walter passed away in 2004. His obituary mentioned his service. It did not mention that he had quietly changed how an army fought. At his funeral, several former tank loaders attended, men who had never met him, but who had learned the technique from others who learned it from France. They understood what he had given them. Today, if you visit the National Archives, Walter's service record lists dates, ranks, and units. Nothing more. But if you stand inside a restored Sherman turret at Fort Knox, the reason becomes obvious. There simply is not enough room to do it any other way. That is how wars are often won, not just by generals or grand strategy, but by ordinary people making the right decision in the worst moment, even when that decision breaks the rules. If this story mattered to you, take a moment to like this video so YouTube shows it to more people who have never heard this name. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want more true stories from World War II that textbooks often miss. And in the comments, tell us where you are watching from and whether someone in your family served. These stories only survive if we keep telling them.